Good day. Welcome to Westchester Talk Radio, westchestertalkradio.com. I'm John Marino, and we are produced by SharcCreative, made possible by Entergy, the Indian Point Energy Center, supporting our communities through April of 2021. Lipolis Electric. Don't be left in the dark. Get Lipolis. And Hightower Westchester, managing your wealth to a fiduciary standard, along with White Plains Hospital. Special thanks to our heroes at White Plains Hospital for all they have done for us during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the Sports Report. We are joined by the sports editor for Journal News, lohud.com, and the Poughkeepsie Journal, Josh Thomson. Josh, good to have you back with us. How are you?
Hi, John. How are you?
All right. Let's get into the high school sports season. We talked back in the fall about the fall season. First of all, with all the adjustments that had to be made, how did the season go?
I think you have to deem it a success. There were other regions in the state that didn't even have a fall season that have held off until basically this point, until this week, for having any sports at all. Section 1 opted to play, the lower and moderate risk sports of soccer and field hockey and, run cross country and tennis. And I think that it had to be deemed a success. There were some places where it was less successful than others, where there were outbreaks and, the team was shut down for a week or for 2 weeks. And, there was definitely some communities where there were very few games played. Yonkers opted out of the season completely. East Ramapo School District, which is Ramapo and Spring Valley over in Rockland County, they actually did not end up playing any games because, there was some, micro clusters in their school districts and that prevented them from getting on the field. But, I think for a lot of other schools it would be deemed successful. They played a dozen games or more. There were regional tournaments that Section 1 held that were more localized than the normal sectional tournaments. That allowed, certainly, more teams to get on the field in the playoffs and probably a better success rate in terms of completing those tournaments. Again, not everyone did. But more did than not, and I think that the athletes and the coaches who participated were happy that they had that opportunity, and I think they were pretty grateful when it was over.
Which team seemed to be most invested during the fall overall with all the sports they took part in?
Well, it's hard to pin one out over another. I mean, I think, it was partially the result of luck, right? That you had no outbreaks in your school versus somebody who did. There were, some teams who were like Pleasantville, defending state girls soccer champion. They didn't win their regional championship. They lost in the final to Bronxville, but that was a team that had an outbreak just before the playoffs. And, wasn't going to, many of the same girls from last year wasn't going to be able to play. They were able to get back for the playoffs. And why? Because in the first round, many JV call-ups came up and played and won the game. I believe it was in overtime to help them advance, then allowing the rest of the team to come back and play. So there were some really interesting stories like that I'm sure, there was some gratitude there for the players who were able to complete their season. But there were other schools where there were teams who didn't play in the playoffs and, who had, would have been top seeds or would have been contenders for their area championship and didn't get to play due to that. And obviously, I'm sure they were really disappointed. But, just what we were hearing, our reporters were hearing throughout the fall was that, whatever they had to do to play, however it ended up looking, that people were really grateful to play.
Were some schools around the area disappointed? You used that word already about not having the opportunity to advance beyond the section, even considering the circumstances.
I think that because of the circumstances, that disappointment became secondary. I think that there are people who probably were disappointed and thought this was their year. They're in certain communities, John, as you know, it's obviously we can always say, oh, we'll come back next year. But, in certain communities, you only get that once in a generation chance to maybe compete for a state championship. Not everybody is, Lakeland field hockey that is up there every year, playing for a state title. And so, I think that there are probably some schools that were disappointed knowing that maybe they won't have a group like this in the future. But I do think that became secondary, once people saw what the circumstances were. And I think generally speaking, I think that, the excitement of being able to play at all kind of won out over those
Yeah, there
disappointments.
seemed to be enough exposure for kids who were seniors during the fall, their senior season, and even juniors who need to be looked at by colleges for next year. Was there enough exposure for at least some of them?
Well, look, this is not a good situation for them. I've heard Rick Pitino, the Iona basketball coach, say that recruiting hasn't been good for them either in terms of not getting to know people, not getting able to see them in person. So it's going to affect everybody. It's going to affect the colleges. It's going to affect the high school seniors and juniors, and in a way, there'll be an impact on the college rosters, when those kids do go to school. So, but, I think at this point it is what it is. Obviously getting any sort of game tape is going to allow you to have, some kind of recruiting video. And I think that's probably what people were hoping for at this point. Now, unfortunately, I think there are a lot of winter athletes and football and volleyball players who were supposed to play in the fall and had their season postponed to March 1st. We're hoping they get some sort of tape, some sort of highlights that they can share. And, right now, obviously it's looking pretty bleak in those terms.
How did schools handle participation, attendance by parents, by fans?
There were 2 athletes allowed per home team at games. Certainly, from what we saw, there were probably more than that were whether it was lining the fences or cheering on from the outside. I went to a soccer championship game at the end of the year. There were a ton of students there supporting. I don't have any problem with that. It was they were spread out. There was plenty of room for them, but it did certainly kind of bend the rules that were supposed to be in place. I think you saw some of that. I think there were some schools that were more strict about it than others. That's the way it's going to be with something like that. Obviously, I think there's a balance you want to strike there between, trying to, abide by the rules and then also, not preventing, parents or friends or whoever to watch their sons and their daughters and their cousins and grandsons and granddaughters to play. So I do think there was kind of a balance there that some schools are trying to strike.
What lessons do you think were learned during the fall that we can take going forward? Adjustments that were made?
I think that the lessons are that, kids at this stage are going to be grateful for whatever they can get in terms of being able to play. I think that, you could have many people who could argue that what the fall season proved was that it was possible to play sports successfully during the pandemic. I think you could have other people who could argue the opposite, who could say, well, look, there were outbreaks everywhere. There were schools that had to shut down. There were schools that only were able to play a handful of games. And that was for an outdoor sport that the state health department had deemed lower risk or moderate risk. And what's going to happen if the competition is played indoors, where we know, COVID-19 obviously is transmitted more readily. And, if it's played in sports where there's more contact. So I think you could basically, depending on your point of view or depending on what how you want to kind of spin it, I think you could say both ways. I do think, though, personally, it was, I think it was a success. Like I said at the beginning, I think it's, there were a lot of athletes who and student athletes who are, looking for an outlet. And obviously, I think the sports that were held in the fall provided them an outlet.
How about practices? How much practice time was there during the fall? And obviously, I would think there would have had to have been a lot of adjustments made with that.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely, I think, some adjustments. There were practices that were probably canceled more easily than they would have been. If there was a fear that something might happen. I think if there are winter sports, I think you'll see that same thing. We've been reporting recently, Stephen Haynes from the Poughkeepsie Journal reported recently about, kind of the changes that people see to this winter sports season. There is allowed indoor track and gymnastics and skiing and bowling and, more lower risk sports. And, there's some ideas out there like, having indoor track meets outdoors during the winter and having all practices outdoors. And that's, obviously if the weather allows. I think, we've seen people say, I think the wind chill has to be below 11 degrees for them to cancel. Then they have to cancel. And I think, you'll see schools that do have practice, maybe more quick to cancel practice, because obviously that's not as important as, preventing, student athletes from getting sick. And I think that's, the type of adjustments that you'll see and, that we've already seen so far this school year.
I say let them practice outside in 11 degrees. A couple of years ago, at Middletown High School for one of the state tournaments in the fall, it was for soccer. Remember, Saturday morning, we worked in 15, 20-degree weather. I think we had 3 games that day, too. So,
Sure, yeah.
So we can do it out in that kind of weather.
Anybody's ever been up to Kingston for a football game, knows
yeah,
you can
that's
play
another situation.
Pretty cool weather. So
also too. Josh Thomson is the sports editor for Journal News, lowhud.com, and for the Poughkeepsie Journal, not far from Kingston. Josh, with this winter sports season upon us now, the word was the January 4th we could begin the winter sports season, but there have been adjustments, and I hate to keep using that word, but that's what they are, already made for this, with some of the sports where more contact or a closer contact or being on top of somebody have not been allowed to start yet, like football, like hockey and basketball.
Yeah, it's not looking good in from those sports. We had a report, it's up online here Thursday morning. The State Department of Health is basically, signaling that they don't have any inkling anytime soon to let high-risk sports back in the field. They're, citing contact tracing data that's, saying that sports is the 7th highest driver, I guess, of infections. Of things they've researched. Obviously, at home gatherings between people is far and away the number one reason, but on their list from contact tracing through cases in the fall, that was 7th on their list. They also are citing, they sent us a link to a story from the New York Times about 22 outbreaks connected to youth hockey tournaments. That's about it in terms of what they're sharing for their data. But the bottom line, whether you agree with them or not, or whether you think that their data is useful or comprehensive or not, is that, the state health department, the governor's offices are the ones who are making that call. And they don't seem inclined to be letting high-risk sports back in the field anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Does there seem to be excitement for the winter season at least? At least we can do this.
Yeah, I mean, is there excitement for the sports who are playing? Sure, but I think that them being allowed to play only kind of underscores, what the other athletes and coaches are missing right now. So I think that for a certain segment of, our community, I think they are excited about getting the opportunity to play. But I think that, a large segment of the community is feeling much differently, and that's not making them feel any better about their situation.
I think that leads to the question of back during the fall, and let's see how this develops now. Did you see kids who would normally play football, for example, get involved a bit more in other sports like soccer, for example? Like if somebody plays basketball, maybe right now they'll go bowl.
Yeah, we did have a couple examples of that back in the fall. I do think it's different than what's going on now, though, because that was where there were 2 seasons for girls volleyball and for boys football that were moved to a different time of the season. Not that we're, kind of had, will we or won't we hanging over their heads. But yeah, we did see that. We saw, a football player, Mayapak, was a 3rd-string goalie on the boys soccer team. And, there were some other examples of situations like that. One of our reporters, Eugene Rapay, wrote a good story where he kind of highlighted a few of those instances. I think that was cross country was another one where there were athletes and tennis, athletes who had maybe, obviously, athletes are all, in good shape and can run, who decided to run because they weren't playing their other sport, or, maybe tennis was something you did as a fun activity with your family and you joined the tennis team this year. We did have a couple of examples of that. Nancy Haggerty, one of our colleagues, she had written a story about North Rockland tennis, where they had a really large tryout, and they had a lot of volleyball players who participated. So, there were certainly some examples of that. I just think the winter will be a different scenario right now.
I remember back in the early 70s, I had a cousin on Long Island who was the third-rated soccer player in New York State. He decided he wanted to play tennis too, just picked up the racket, walked on the tennis court, and was the star of the tennis team too. But that's an athlete for you. These athletes are able just to adjust sport to sport. And if they hadn't really played a sport much before, like you say, tennis, a family thing, they can get out there and do what they have to do and excel at a new sport too. And that does happen. And it was good to see that happen in the fall, where some kids who didn't play their normal sport move on to play another sport. And hopefully with football and the fall sports season number 2 ready to begin, supposedly is supposed to begin beginning of March 1st, I guess. Do you see that happening at this point?
At this point, I've told football coaches for months, and I really strongly believe this. A lot of them now are advocating for football to be played. They're focused on football. I've said all along, I think that it's a huge mistake to expect that no high-risk sports are going to be played this winter, but that they're going to allow football players back on the field starting March 1st. I don't see that being the way, the type of sport football is, the highest of high contact, maybe with the exception of wrestling. I just don't see that as the first sport that's going to be allowed on the field. I hope that I'm wrong, because I want there to be high school football. I hope for the athletes and the coaches and the schools. It's such an important part of the high school experience for many, many, many people at every school. And I really hope they're allowed to play. But the news that there may not be winter high school high-risk sports, to me signals that there's a good chance there won't be that football season in March and April that people have been excited about.
Is there a cutoff date for basketball, for hockey, for those winter sports that have not yet been allowed to start?
No, there's no established cutoff date. Right now, the NYSPHSAA, which is the state high school sports organization, they've kind of put high-risk sports on indefinite hold, waiting for the word from the governor's office. So there's no drop-dead date, but, we have heard that in Section 1, at least, that the athletic directors have discussed having one, because I think they're, fearful that the later you get into the winter and, the closer you get to the spring, that, logistically it would just be too difficult to kind of have everything that's left at once. So while there is no current drop dead data, that doesn't mean there won't be one in the future.
Mm-hmm. Now and I hate to put it in these kind of terms and context, but for somebody who plays basketball, hockey, somebody who's a wrestler and is thinking about picking up another sport, they really can't make that commitment to do that until they definitely know that there's not going to be basketball or hockey or wrestling, and they may just have to run the risk of switching sports and then getting word down the road 4 or 6 weeks down the road that their original sport is going to be played. So that could put them in a bind.
Yeah, and that's why I said to you, I think it's different than the fall, because football and volleyball had been moved out of the fall season. I also think we're talking about such a low percentage of athletes that I think, the majority of athletes are going to be committed to their primary sport. And I don't think you'd see that affect too many people, and certainly not, like the more serious athletes. I don't think that would affect them as much.
Now, I know this is about 4 months away, if I remember correctly. May 1st is the startup date for spring sports, and this is way in advance. What do you see happening with that potentially at the moment?
Well, I certainly would have a lot more optimism about those. Most of those sports outside of lacrosse are considered lower or moderate risk. They're all played outdoors. Obviously, the weather will be better, so outdoor sports, it's more feasible for them to be played. That's a complication that we're not even thinking about right now in terms of March. But if it's below 11-degree wind chill or there's snow on the ground, there's not going to be games played. So, but that's a whole other story for the those fall sports that have been moved. Yeah, I definitely would have more optimism about spring sports, but it's such a long way off from that now. I mean, we'd hope at that point more people in schools and in the communities in general will be vaccinated. But we don't know the exact timeline for that. So, still so many questions up in the air, but certainly I'd feel better about that than I would feel about, sports being played, whether it's winter sports or some of those fall sports that were moved.
And I think by the next time we talk, we'll have more of an update on all of that, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Josh Thomson is the sports editor for the Journal News, LoHa.com, and Poughkeepsie Journal. Josh, thank you for being back with us here on Westchester Talk Radio. We'll talk soon.
No problem. Thanks, John.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Here on the Sports Report, I'm John Marino, and we are made possible by people like Wartburg Healthcare and Rehabilitation and Park Sterling Realty, Wartburg in Mount Vernon, Park Sterling in Bronxville, and Michael Labriola, Landscape Design and Construction of Armonk, along with our title sponsor, Entergy, the Indian Point Energy Center, supporting our communities through April of this year, 2021. We are produced by SharcCreative, and catch all of our Westchester, Fairfield County, Putnam, and Dutchess Talk Radio programming on our YouTube channel, SharcCreative YouTube.